grade. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the increased violence that continues to take place throughout our country. So far, a lot of the battling between the free and slave states, the efforts to maintain the balance between them, has been, fought in Congress in Washington, D.C. by lawmakers. But now, as we're going to see, people are going to take the fight into their own hands, and violence is going to end up spilling out in Kansas territory, creating a era in our history known as Bleeding Kansas. So the first thing we have to talk about to sort of set the stage here is something that is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is probably one of the more important pieces of legislation that would irrevocably draw us closer to a civil war. So the Nebraska Territory, as you can see on the map, this was largely unsettled land um, created from the Louisiana Purchase, right? And the proponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the creator of this piece of law, was Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Now, we'll later come to know him a little bit better when he starts to debate Abraham Lincoln. But right now, he's looking to settle territory and get the opportunity to build the Transcontinental Railroad through these territories and into Chicago. So that was his motivation. Um, and one of the things that he wanted to do in order to get this territory settled and get this Kansas-Nebraska Act passed was get the support of Southern delegates. And so to do that, he proposed making any territory in either Kansas or Nebraska, any of it open to popular sovereignty, meaning people can vote if they want their state to be free or slave. Now, this caused a lot of problems because, as we know from our earlier class, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 established this sort of imaginary line or border between North and South, or free and slave. As we can see here, that Missouri Compromise line has been established. Missouri is the only, real state that was admitted as a slave state after this. They were the only exception. But if all of a sudden this Kansas territory, Nebraska territory, gets settled, and they're allowed to open up the expansion of slavery, then this would indeed um, basically do away with the Missouri Compromise. And for a long time, like 30 some years, the Missouri Compromise has maintained the peace between free and slave states. Again, this has all been about maintaining a balance, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act would basically do away with that altogether and increase the outrage on both sides, um, and as I said, lead us closer to war. So, what happened after the Kansas Territory was opened up? Well, in order to get sort of in on the first elections, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers began to move in, and they had their own violent clashes with one another. The thing that they were trying to do was get enough people on both sides um, to settle in this territory, and then when they held elections, they can get either their pro-slavery or anti-slavery lawmakers into office. So when the first elections were held in 1855, um, some extraordinary things happened. There was a large band of pro-slavery, as they called them, border ruffians from Missouri, ended up crossing into Kansas and voting illegally. Thousands of people who had no right to vote in Kansas came in, voted illegally for pro-slavery legislatures. And because of that, a pro-slavery legislator is ultimately elected. And once they're in office, they start passing all kinds of pro-slavery laws, like horrible punishments for people who, help escape slaves or even speak out against slavery. And because of this, anti-slavery settlers decide to create their own rival government with their own governor and their own legislature, and this creates a lot of chaos between the two groups. And that chaos turns into violence in 1856, pro-slavery activists uh, go into a town of Lawrence and raid it. They, they break into shops, they steal stuff, they set properties on fire, they burn down a hotel, and they caused a lot of damage throughout this town. Um, and so, in response to that, just a few days later, all right, the famous abolitionist John Brown, with his sons, rode into what was known as the Potawatomi settlement and ended up killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. Now, this isn't the only acts of violence that occurred in Kansas. There were multiple occasions of violence on both sides, just pro-slavery and anti-slavery people waging an open war throughout the territory, and that's why the territory became known as Bleeding Kansas. And just to give you a better idea of what kind of violence we're talking about here, well, this it wasn't just restricted to Kansas. All right, so people all throughout the country are openly fighting with one another on this issue of slavery. People who are looking to abolish it, people who are looking to defend it. Their fights are breaking out in the streets, and fights are even breaking out in Washington D.C. Um, there was a time when Senator Charles Sumner, he was a probably the most abolitionist senator that was around at the time. Just after the Potawatomi massacre, actually no, it's just before the Potawatomi massacre. He speaks out against slavery, denounces a bunch of pro-slavery politicians, and he goes after one in particular from South Carolina. Just verbally attacks them, admonishes them, and so in response, Congressman Preston Brooks, who was a nephew of one of these senators, ends up walking into Sumner's office a few days later and attacks him, beats him with a cane until he is unconscious. You can see here a political cartoon portraying that event. Um, People in the background with smiles on their faces, with frowns. There's a lot of passion on both sides. People in the South believe largely that Sumner got what he deserved. Obviously, people in the North were outraged. Um, a lot of them because of the violence happening in Kansas, the violence happening in the Senate. A lot of Northerners were, again, just believed that slavery would ultimately lead to violence always. A lot of them ended up joining abolitionist causes. And again, this is just one of those significant events that is going to draw us closer to war. Right now, as they're saying, the fight is not just being waged in Washington, D.C., it's being waged all over the country with people openly attacking each other over this issue of slavery. And it's not going to stop up until civil war is proclaimed and both sides end up attacking one another on the battlefield. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. All right, I'm Bleeding Kansas. So make sure you guys do the reading in your book, lesson 2. Okay, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about Dred Scott v. Sanford, a very famous legal case. So I'll have some activities for that. We'll talk about it a little bit more, and yeah, we'll go from there. All right. You guys have any questions or comments? Please post them on Loom or Edmodo. All right. Thank you very much.